into its waves again, and swim to La Mer, equally arid but larger, and consequently better adapted for concealment. An overhanging rock offered him a temporary shelter, and scarcely had he availed himself of it, when the tempest burst forth in all its fury. Edmund felt the trembling of the rock beneath which he lay. The waves, dashing themselves against it, wetted him with their spray. He was safely sheltered, and yet he felt dizzy in the midst of the warring of the elements, and the dazzling brightness of the lightning. It seemed to him that the island trembled to its base, and that it would, like a vessel at anchor, break moorings, and bear him off into the centre of the storm. He then recollected that he had not eaten or drunk for 24 hours. He extended his hands, and drank greedily of the rainwater that had lodged in a hollow of the rock. As he rose, a flash of lightning, that seemed to rive the remotest heights of heaven, illumined the darkness. By its light, between the island of Le Maire and Cape Croiselle, a quarter of a league distant, Dantès saw a fishing boat, driven rapidly like a spectre before the power of winds and waves. A second after, he saw it again, approaching with frightful rapidity. Dantès cried at the top of his voice to warn them of their danger, but they saw it themselves. Another flash showed him 4 men clinging to the shattered mast and the rigging, while a 5th clung to the broken rudder. The men he beheld saw him undoubtedly, for their cries were carried to his ears by the wind. Above the splintered mast, a sail, rent to tatters, was waving. Suddenly the ropes that still held it gave way, and it disappeared in the darkness of the night, like a vast sea-bird. At the same moment a violent crash was heard, and cries of distress. Dantès, from his rocky perch, saw the shattered vessel, and among the fragments the floating forms of the hapless sailors. Then all was dark again. Dantès ran down the rocks, at the risk of being himself dashed to pieces. He listened, he groped about, but he heard and saw nothing. The cries had ceased, and the tempest continued to rage. By degrees the wind abated. Vast grey clouds rolled towards the west, and the blue firmament appeared studded with bright stars. Soon a red streak became visible in the horizon. The waves whitened, a light played over them, and gilded their foaming crests with gold. It was day. Dantès stood mute and motionless before this majestic spectacle, as if he now beheld it for the first time. And indeed, since his captivity in the Château d'If, he had forgotten that such scenes were ever to be witnessed. He turned toward the fortress, and looked at both sea and land. The gloomy building rose from the bosom of the ocean, with imposing majesty, and seemed to dominate the scene. It was about 5 o'clock. The sea continued to get calmer. "In 2 or 3 hours," thought Dantès, "the turnkey will enter my chamber, find the body of my poor friend, recognize it, seek for me in vain, and give the alarm. Then the tunnel will be discovered. The men who cast me into the sea, and who must have heard the cry I uttered, will be questioned. The boats filled with armed soldiers will pursue the wretched fugitive. The cannon will warn everyone to refuse shelter to a man wandering about naked and famished. The police of Marseille will be on the alert by land, whilst the governor pursues me by sea. I am cold, I am hungry, I have lost even the knife that saved me. Oh, my God, I have suffered enough, surely. Have pity on me, and do for me what I am unable to do for myself." As Dantès, his eyes turned in the direction of the Château d'If, uttered this prayer, he saw off the farther point of the island of Pomègue a small vessel with lateen sail skimming the sea like a gull in search of prey, and with his sailor's eye he knew it to be a Genoese tartan. She was coming out of Marseille harbor, and was standing out to sea rapidly, her sharp prow cleaving through the waves. "Oh," cried Edmund, "to think that in half an hour I could join her, did I not fear being questioned, detected, and conveyed back to Marseille! What can I do? What story can I invent? Under pretext of trading along the coast, these men, who are in reality smugglers, will prefer selling me to doing a good action. I must wait, but I cannot. I am starving. In a few hours my strength will be utterly exhausted. Besides, perhaps I have not been missed at the fortress. I can pass as one of the sailors wrecked last night. My story will be accepted, for there is no one left to contradict me." As he spoke, Dantès looked toward the spot where the fishing vessel had been wrecked, and started. The red cap of one of the sailors hung to a point of the rock, and some timbers that had formed part of the vessel's keel floated at the foot of the crag. In an instant Dantès' plan was formed. He swam to the cap, placed it on his head, seized one of the timbers, and struck out so as to cut across the course the vessel was taking. "I am saved," murmured he, and this conviction restored his strength. He soon saw that the vessel, with the wind dead ahead, was tacking between the Chateau d'If and the tower of Planier. For an instant he feared lest, instead of keeping in shore, she should stand out to sea, but he soon saw that she would pass, like most vessels bound for Italy, between the islands of Jaros and Casalegagnes. However, the vessel and the swimmer insensibly neared one another, and in one of its tacks the tartan bore down with 1/4 mile of him. He rose on the waves, making signs of distress, but no one on board saw him, and the vessel stood on another tack. Dantès would have shouted, but he knew that the wind would drown his voice. It was then he rejoined at his precaution in taking the timber, for without it he would have been unable, perhaps, to reach the vessel, certainly to return to shore, should he be unsuccessful in attracting attention. Dantès, although sure as to what course the vessel would take, had yet watched it anxiously until it tacked and stood towards him. Then he advanced, but before they could meet, the vessel again changed her course. By a violent effort he rose half out of the water, waving his cap and uttering a loud shout peculiar to sailors. This time he was both seen and heard, and the tartan instantly steered towards him. At the same time he saw they were about to lower the boat. An instant after, the boat, rowed by 2 men, advanced rapidly towards him. Dantès let go of the timber, which he now thought to be useless, and swam vigorously to meet them. But he had reckoned too much upon his strength, and then he realized how serviceable the timber had been to him. His arms became stiff, his legs lost their flexibility, and he was almost breathless. He shouted again. The 2 sailors redoubled their efforts, and one of them cried in Italian, "Courage!" The word reached his ear as a wave, which he no longer had the strength to surmount, passed over his head. He rose again to the surface, struggled with the last desperate effort of a drowning man, uttered a 3rd cry, and felt himself sinking, as if the fatal cannon shot were again tied to his feet. The water passed over his head, and the sky turned gray. A convulsive movement again brought him to the surface. He felt himself seized by the hair. Then he saw and heard nothing. He had fainted. When he opened his eyes, Dantès found himself on the deck of the tartan. His first care was to see what course they were taking. They were rapidly leaving the Chateau d'If behind. Dantès was so exhausted that the exclamation of joy he uttered was mistaken for a sigh. As we have said, he was lying on the deck. A sailor was rubbing his limbs with a woolen cloth. Another, whom he recognized as the one who had cried out, "Courage!" held a gourd full of rum to his mouth, while the third, an old sailor, at once the pilot and captain, looked on with that egotistical pity men feel for a misfortune that they have escaped yesterday, and which may overtake them tomorrow. A few drops of the rum restored suspended animation, while the friction of his limbs restored their elasticity. "Who are you?" said the pilot in bad French. "I am," replied Dantès in bad Italian, "a Maltese sailor. We were coming from Syracuse laden with grain. The storm of last night overtook us at Cape Morgan, and we were wrecked on these rocks." "Where do you come from?" "From these rocks that I had the good luck to cling to while our captain and the rest of the crew were all lost. I saw your vessel, and fearful of being left to perish on the desolate island, I swam off on a piece of wreckage to try and intercept your course. You have saved my life, "And I thank you," continued Dantès. "I was lost when one of your sailors caught hold of my hair." "It was I," said a sailor of a frank and manly appearance, "and it was time, for you were sinking." "Yes," returned Dantès, holding out his hand, "I thank you again." "I almost hesitated, though," replied the sailor. "You looked more like a brigand than an honest man, with your beard 6 inches and your hair a foot long." Dantès recollected that his hair and beard had not been cut all the time he was at the Château d'If. "Yes," said he, "I made a vow to Our Lady of the Grotto not to cut my hair or beard for 10 years if I were saved in a moment of danger; but today the vow expires." "Now, what are we to do with you?" said the captain. "Alas, anything, if you please. My captain is dead. I have barely escaped, but I am a good sailor. Leave me at the first port you make. I shall be sure to find employment." "Do you know the Mediterranean?" "I have sailed it over since my childhood." "You know the best harbors?" "There are few ports that I could not enter or leave with a bandage over my eyes." "I say, captain," said the sailor who had cried courage to Dantès, "if what he says is true, what hinders his staying with us?" "If he says true," said the captain doubtingly, "but in his present condition he will promise anything, and take his chance of keeping it afterwards." "I will do more than promise," said Dantès. "We shall see," returned the other, smiling. "Where are you going?" asked Dantès. "To Leghorn." "Then why, instead of tacking so frequently, do you not sail nearer the wind?" "Because we should run straight on to the island of Ryan." "You shall pass by it by 20 fathoms." "Take the helm, and let us see what you know." The young man took the helm, felt to see if the vessel answered the rudder promptly, and seeing that, without being a first-rate sailor, she yet was tolerably obedient. "To the sheets," said he. The 4 seamen who composed the crew obeyed, while the pilot looked on. "Haul taut." They obeyed. "Belay." This order was also executed, and the vessel passed, as Dantès had predicted, 20 fathoms to windward. "Bravo! bravo!" said the captain. "Bravo!" repeated the sailors, and they all looked with astonishment at this man whose eye now disclosed an intelligence, and his body a vigor they had not thought him capable of showing. "You see," said Dantès, quitting the helm, "I shall be of some use to you, at least during the voyage. If you do not want me at Leghorn, you can leave me there, and I will pay you out of the first wages I get for my food and the clothes you lend me." "Ah," said the captain, "we can agree very well if you are reasonable." "Give me what you give the others, and it will be all right," returned Dantès. "That's not fair," said the seaman who had saved Dantès, "for you know more than we do." "What is that to you, Jacopo?" returned the captain. "Every one is free to ask what he pleases." "That's true," replied Jacopo. "I only make a remark." "Well, you would do much better to find him a jacket and a pair of trousers, if you have them." "No," said Jacopo, "but I have a shirt and a pair of trousers." "That is all I want," interrupted Dantès. Jacopo dived into the hold and soon returned with what Edmond wanted. "Now then, do you wish for anything else?" said the patron. "A piece of bread and another glass of the capital rum I tasted, for I have not eaten or drunk for a very long time." He had not tasted food for 40 hours. A piece of bread was brought, and Jacopo offered him the gourd. "Larboard your helm!" cried the captain to the steersman. Dantès glanced that way as he lifted the gourd to his mouth, then paused with his hand in mid-air. "Hollo! What's the matter at Château d'If?" said the captain. A small white cloud, which had attracted Dantès' attention, crowned the summit of the bastion of the Château d'If. At the same moment the faint report of a gun was heard. The sailors looked at one another. "What is this?" asked the captain. "A prisoner has escaped from the Château d'If, and they are firing the alarm gun," replied Dantès. The captain glanced at him, but he had lifted the rum to his lips and was drinking it with so much composure that suspicions, if the captain had any, died away. "At any rate," murmured he, "if it be, so much the better, for I have made a rare acquisition." Under pretense of being fatigued, Dantès asked to take the helm. The steersman, glad to be relieved, looked at the captain, and the latter by a sign indicated that he might abandon it to his new comrade. Dantès could thus keep his eye on Marseilles. "What is the day of the month?" he asked Jacopo, who sat down beside him. "The 28th of February." "In what year?" "In what year? You ask me in what year?" "Yes," replied the young man, "I ask you in what year." "You have forgotten, then?" "I got such a fright last night," replied Dantès, smiling, "that I have almost lost my memory. I ask you, what year is it?" "The year 1829," returned Jacopo. It was 14 years, day for day, since Dantès' arrest. He was 19 when he entered the Château d'If. He was 33 when he escaped. A sorrowful smile passed over his face. He asked himself what had become of Mercédès, who must believe him dead. Then his eyes lighted up with hatred as he thought of the 3 men who had caused him so long and wretched a captivity. He renewed against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort the oath of implacable vengeance he had made in his dungeon. This oath was no longer a vain menace, for the fastest sailor in the Mediterranean would have been unable to overtake the little tartan, that with every stitch of canvas set was flying before the wind to Leghorn. End of chapter 22.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain, and for more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Kristen Luoma at greenkri.com. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 22, The Smugglers. Dantès had not been a day on board before he had a very clear idea of the men with whom his lot had been cast. Without having been in the school of the Abbé Faria, the worthy master of the young Amelia, the name of the Genoese tartan, knew a smattering of all the tongues spoken on the shores of that large lake called the Mediterranean, from the Arabic to the Provençal, and this, while it spared him interpreters, persons always troublesome and frequently indiscreet, gave him great facilities of communication, either with the vessels he met at sea, with the small boats sailing along the coast, or with the people without name, country, or occupation, who are always seen on the quays of the seaports, and who live by hidden and mysterious means, which we must suppose to be the direct gift of Providence, as they have no visible means of support. It is fair to assume that Dantès was on board a smuggler. At first, the captain had received Dantès on board with a certain degree of distrust. He was very well known to the customs officers of the coast, and as there was between these worthies and himself a perpetual battle of wits, he had at first thought that Dantès might be an emissary of these industrious guardians of rights and duties, who perhaps employed this ingenious means of learning some of the secrets of his trade. But the skillful manner in which Dantès had handled the lugger had entirely reassured him, and then, when he saw the light plume of the smoke floating above the bastion of the Château d'If, and heard the distant report, he was instantly struck with the idea that he had on board his vessel one whose coming and going, like that of kings, was accompanied with salutes of artillery. This made him less uneasy, it must be owned, than if the newcomer had proved to be a customs officer. But this supposition also disappeared like the first, when he beheld the perfect tranquillity of his recruit. Edmund thus had the advantage of knowing what the owner was, without the owner knowing who he was, and however the old sailor and his crew tried to pump him, they extracted nothing more from him. He gave accurate descriptions of Naples and Malta, which he knew as well as Marseilles, and held stoutly to his first story. Thus the Genoese, subtle as he was duped by Edmund, in whose favor his mild demeanor, his nautical skill, and his admirable dissimulation pleaded. Moreover, it is possible that the Genoese was one of those shrewd persons who know nothing but what they should know, and believe nothing but what they should believe. In this state of mutual understanding they reached Leghorn. Here Edmund was to undergo another trial. He was to find out whether he could recognize himself, as he had not seen his own face for 14 years. He had preserved a tolerably good remembrance of what the youth had been, and was now to find out what the man had become. His comrades believed that his vow was fulfilled. As he had 20 times touched at Leghorn, he remembered a barber in St. Ferdinand Street. He went there to have his beard and hair cut. The barber gazed in amazement at this man with the long, thick, and black hair and beard, which gave his head the appearance of one of Titian's portraits. At this period it was not the fashion to wear so large a beard and hair so long. Now a barber would only be surprised if a man gifted with such advantages should consent voluntarily to deprive himself of them. The Leghorn barber said nothing and went to work. When the operation was concluded, and Edmund felt that his chin was completely smooth and his hair reduced to its usual length, he asked for a hand-glass. He was now, as we have said, 33 years of age, and his 14 years' imprisonment had produced a great transformation in his appearance. Dantès had entered the Château d'If with the round, open, smiling face of a young and happy man, with whom the early paths of life have been smooth, and who anticipates a future corresponding with his past. This was now all changed. The oval face was lengthened. His smiling mouth had assumed the firm and marked lines which betoken resolution. His eyebrows were arched beneath a brow furrowed with thought. His eyes were full of melancholy, and from their depths occasionally sparkled gloomy fires of misanthropy and hatred. His complexion, so long kept from the sun, had now that pale color which produces, when the features are encircled with black hair, the aristocratic beauty of the man of the north. The profound learning he had acquired had besides diffused over his features a refined intellectual expression. And he had also acquired, being naturally of a goodly stature, that vigor which a frame possesses which has so long concentrated all its force within itself. To the elegance of a nervous and slight form had succeeded the solidity of a rounded and muscular figure. As to his voice, prayers, sobs, and imprecations had changed it so that at times it was of a singularly penetrating sweetness, and at others rough and almost hoarse. Moreover, from being so long in twilight or darkness, his eyes had acquired the faculty of distinguishing objects in the night, common to the hyena and the wolf. Edmund smiled when he beheld himself. It was impossible that his best friend, if indeed he had any friends left, could recognize him. He could not recognize himself. The master of the young Amelia, who was very desirous of retaining amongst his crew a man of Edmund's value, had offered to advance him funds out of his future profits, which Edmund has accepted. His next care on leaving the barber's, who had achieved his first metamorphosis, was to enter a shop and buy a complete sailor's suit. A garb, as we all know, very simple and consisting of white trousers, a striped shirt, and a cap. It was in this costume, and bringing back to Jacopo the shirt and trousers he had lent him, that Edmund reappeared before the captain of the lugger, who had made him tell his story over and over again before he could believe him, or recognize in the neat and trim sailor the man with thick and matted beard, hair tangled with seaweed, and body soaking in sea brine, whom he had picked up naked and nearly drowned. Attracted by his prepossessing appearance, he renewed his offers of an engagement to Dantès. But Dantès, who had his own projects, would not agree for a longer time than 3 months. The young Amelia had a very active crew, very obedient to their captain, who lost as little time as possible. He had scarcely been a week at Leghorn before the hold of his vessel was filled with printed muslins, contraband cottons, English powder, and tobacco on which the excise had forgotten to put its mark. The master was to get all this out of Leghorn free of duties, and land it on the shores of Corsica, where certain speculators undertook to forward the cargo to France. They sailed. Edmund was again cleaving the azure sea which had been the first horizon of his youth, and which he had so often dreamed of in prison. He left Gorgone on his right and La Pianosa on his left, and went towards the country of Paoli and Napoleon. The The next morning, going on deck, as he always did at an early hour, the patron found Dantès leaning against the bulwarks, gazing with intense earnestness at a pile of granite rocks, which the rising sun tinged with rosy light. It was the island of Monte Cristo. The young Amelia left it 3/4 of a league to the larboard, and kept on for Corsica. Dantès thought, as they passed so closely to the island, whose name was so interesting to him, that he had only to leap into the sea, and in half an hour be at the promised land. But then what could he do without instruments to discover his treasure, without arms to defend himself? Besides, what would the sailors say? What would the patron think? He must wait. Fortunately, Dantès had learned how to wait. He had waited 14 years for his liberty, and now he was free, he could wait at least 6 months or a year for wealth. Would he not have accepted liberty without riches if it had been offered to him? Besides, were not those riches chimerical? Offspring of the brain of the poor Abbé Faria, had they not died with him? It is true, the letter of the Cardinal Spada was singularly circumstantial, and Dantès repeated it to himself from one end to the other, for he had not forgotten a word. Evening came, and Edmund saw the island tinged with the shades of twilight, and then disappear in the darkness from all eyes but his own, for he, with vision accustomed to the gloom of a prison, continued to behold it last of all, for he remained alone upon deck. The next morn broke off the coast of Aleria. All day they coasted, and in the evening saw fires lighted on land. The position of these was no doubt a signal for landing, for a ship's lantern was hung up at the masthead instead of the streamer, and they came to within a gunshot of the shore. Dantès noticed that the captain of the Young Amelia had, as he neared the land, mounted 2 small culverins, which, without making much noise, can throw a 4-ounce ball 1,000 paces or so. But on this occasion the precaution was superfluous, and everything proceeded with the utmost smoothness and politeness. 4 shallops came off with very little noise alongside the lugger, which no doubt, in acknowledgment of the compliment, lowered her own shallop into the sea, and the 5 boats worked so well that by 2 o'clock in the morning all the cargo was out of the Young Amelia and on terra firma. The same night, such a man of regularity was the patron of the Young Amelia. The profits were divided, and each man had 100 Tuscan livres, or about 80 francs. But the voyage was not ended. They turned the bowsprit towards Sardinia, where they intended to take in a cargo, which was to replace what had been discharged. The second operation was as successful as the first. The Young Amelia was in luck. This new cargo was destined for the coast of the Duchy of Lucca, and consisted almost entirely of Havana cigars, sherry, and Malaga wines. There they had a bit of a skirmish in getting rid of the duties. The excise was, in truth, the everlasting enemy of the patron of the Young Amelia. A customs officer was laid low, and 2 sailors wounded. Dantès was one of the latter, a ball having touched him in the left shoulder. Dantès was almost glad of this affray, and almost pleased at being wounded, for they were rude lessons which taught him with what eye he could view danger, and with what endurance he could bear suffering. He had contemplated danger with a smile, and when wounded had exclaimed with the great philosopher, "Pain, thou art not an evil." He had, moreover, looked upon the customs officer wounded to death, and whether from heat of blood produced by the encounter, or chill of human sentiment, this sight had made but slight impression upon him. Dantès was on the way he desired to follow, and was moving towards the end he wished to achieve. His heart was in a fair way of petrifying in his bosom. Jacopo, seeing him fall, had believed him killed, and rushing towards him raised him up, and then attended to him with all the kindness of a devoted comrade. This world was not then so good as Dr. Pangloss believed it, neither was it so wicked as Dantès thought it, since this man, who had nothing to expect from his comrade but the inheritance of his share of the prize money, manifested so much sorrow when he saw him fall. Fortunately, as we have said, Edmund was only wounded, and with certain herbs gathered at certain seasons, and sold to the smugglers by the old Sardinian women, the wound soon closed. Edmund then resolved to try Jacopo, and offered him in return for his attention a share of his prize money, but Jacopo refused it indignantly. As a result of the sympathetic devotion which Jacopo had from the first bestowed on Edmund, the latter was moved to a certain degree of affection. But this sufficed for Jacopo, who instinctively felt that Edmund had a right to superiority of position, a superiority which Edmund had concealed from all others, and from this time the kindness which Edmund showed him was enough for the brave seaman. Then in the long days on board ship, when the vessel, gliding on with security over the azure sea, required no care but the hand of the helmsman, thanks to the favourable winds that swelled her sails, Edmund, with a chart in his hand, became the instructor of Jacopo, as the poor Abbé Faria had been his tutor. He pointed out to him the bearings of the coast, explained to him the variations of the compass, and taught him to read in that vast book opened over our heads which they call heaven, and where God writes in azure with letters of diamonds. And when Jacopo inquired of him, "What is the use of teaching all these things to a poor sailor like me?" Edmund replied, "Who knows? You may one day be the captain of a vessel. Your fellow countryman, Bonaparte, became emperor." We had forgotten to say that Jacopo was a Corsican. 2 months and a half elapsed in these trips, and Edmund had become as skilful a coaster as he had been a hardy seaman. He had formed an acquaintance with all the smugglers on the coast, and learned all the Masonic signs by which these half-pirates recognize each other. He had passed and repassed his island of Monte Cristo 20 times, but not once had he found an opportunity of landing there. He then formed a resolution. As soon as his engagement with the patron of the young Amelia ended, he would hire a small vessel on his own account, for in his several voyages he had amassed 100 piastres, and under some pretext land at the island of Monte Cristo. Then he would be free to make his researches, not perhaps entirely at liberty, for he would be doubtless watched by those who accompanied him. But in this world we must risk something. Prison had made Edmund prudent, and he was desirous of running no risk whatever. But in vain did he rack his imagination. Fertile as it was, he could not devise any plan for reaching the island without companionship. Dantès was tossed about on these doubts and wishes, when the patron, who had great confidence in him, and was very desirous of retaining him in his service, took him by the arm one evening and led him to a tavern on the Via del Oglio, where the leading smugglers of Leghorn used to congregate and discuss affairs connected with their trade. Already Dantès had visited this maritime bourse 2 or 3 times, and seeing all these hardy free traders, who supplied the whole coast for nearly 200 leagues in extent, he had asked himself, what power might not that man attain who should give the impulse of his will to all these contrary and diverging minds? This time was a great matter that was under discussion, connected with a vessel laden with Turkey carpets, stuffs of the Levant, and cashmeres. It was necessary to find some neutral ground on which an exchange could be made, and then to try and land these goods on the coast of France. If the venture was successful, the profit would be enormous. There would be a gain of 50 or 60 piastres each for the crew. The patron of the young Amelia proposed as a place of landing the island of Monte Cristo, which being completely deserted, and having neither soldiers nor revenue officers, seemed to have been placed in the midst of the ocean since the time of the heathen Olympus by Mercury, the god of merchants and robbers, classes of mankind which we in modern times have separated, if not made distinct, but which antiquity appears to have included in the same category. At the mention of Monte Cristo, Dantès started with joy. He rose to conceal his emotion, and took a turn around the smoky tavern, where all the languages of the known world were jumbled in a lingua franca. When he again joined the 2 persons who had been discussing the matter, it had been decided that they should touch at Monte Cristo and set out on the following night. Edmund, being consulted, was of opinion that the island afforded every possible security, and that great enterprises to be well done should be done quickly. Nothing, then, was altered in the plan, and orders were given to get under way next night, and, wind and weather permitting, to make the neutral island by the following day. End of chapter 22. The Count of Monte Cristo.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 23. The Island of Monte Cristo. Thus, at length, by one of the unexpected strokes of fortune which sometimes befall those who have for a long time been the victims of an evil destiny, Dantes was about to secure the opportunity he wished for, by simple and natural means, to land on the island without incurring any suspicion. One night more, and he would be on his way. The night was one of feverish distraction, and in its progress visions good and evil passed through Dante's mind. If he closed his eyes, he saw Cardinal Spada's letter written on the wall in characters of flame. If he slept for a moment, the wildest dreams haunted his brain. He ascended into grottos paved with emeralds, with panels of rubies, and the roof glowing with diamond stalactites. Pearls fell drop by drop, as subterranean waters filter in their caves. Edmund, amazed, wonderstruck, filled his pockets with the radiant gems, and then returned to daylight, when he discovered that his prizes had all changed into common pebbles. He then endeavoured to re-enter the marvellous grottos, but they had suddenly receded, and now the path became a labyrinth, and then the entrance vanished, and in vain did he tax his memory for the magic and mysterious word which opened the splendid caverns of Ali Baba to the Arabian fisherman. All was useless. The treasure disappeared, and had again reverted to the genie from whom for a moment he had hoped to carry it off. The day came at length, and was almost as feverish as the night had been. But it brought reason to the aid of imagination, and Dantes was then enabled to arrange a plan which had hitherto been vague and unsettled in his brain. Night came, and with it the preparations for departure, and these preparations served to conceal Dante's agitation. He had by degrees assumed such authority over his companions that he was almost like a commander on board, and as his orders were always clear, distinct, and easy of execution, his comrades obeyed him with celerity and pleasure. The old patron did not interfere, for he too had recognized the superiority of Dantes over the crew and himself. He saw in the young man his natural successor, and regretted that he had not a daughter, since he might have bound Edmund to him by a more secure alliance. At 7 o'clock in the evening all was ready, and at 10 minutes past 7 they doubled the lighthouse just as the beacon was kindled. The sea was calm, and with a fresh breeze from the southeast they sailed beneath a bright blue sky, in which God also lighted up in turn his beacon lights, each of which is a world. Dantes told them that all hands might turn in, and he would take the helm. When the Maltese, for so they called Dantes, had said this, it was sufficient, and all went to their bunks contentedly. This frequently happened. Dantes, cast from solitude into the world, frequently experienced an imperious desire for solitude, and what solitude is more complete or more poetical than that of a ship floating in isolation on the sea during the obscurity of the night, in the silence of immensity, and under the eye of heaven? Now, this solitude was peopled with his thoughts, the night lighted up by his illusions, and the silence animated by his anticipations. When the patron awoke, the vessel was hurrying on with every sail set and every sail full with the breeze. They were making nearly 10 knots an hour. The island of Monte Cristo loomed large in the horizon. Edmund resigned the lugger to the master's care, and went and lay down in his hammock. But in spite of a sleepless night, he could not close his eyes for a moment. 2 hours afterward he came on deck, as the boat was about to double the island of Elba. They were just abreast of Marichiana, and beyond the flat but verdant isle of La Pianosa. The peak of Monte Cristo, reddened by the burning sun, was seen against the azure sky. Dantes ordered the helmsman to put down his helm in order to leave La Pianosa to starboard, as he knew that he should shorten his course by 2 or 3 knots. After 5 o'clock in the evening the island was distinct, and everything on it was plainly perceptible, owing to that clearness of the atmosphere peculiar to the light which the rays of the sun cast at its setting. Edmund gazed very earnestly at the mass of rocks which gave out all the variety of twilight colours, from the brightest pink to the deepest blue, and from time to time his cheeks flushed, his brow darkened, and a mist passed over his eyes. Never did gamester, whose whole fortune is staked on one cast of the die, experience the anguish which Edmund felt in his paroxysms of hope. Night came, and at 10 o'clock they anchored. The young Amelia was first at the rendezvous. In spite of his usual command over himself, Dantes could not restrain his impetuosity. He was the first to jump on shore, and, had he dared, he would, like Lucius Brutus, have kissed his Mother Earth. It was dark, but at 11 o'clock the moon rose in the midst of the ocean, whose every wave she silvered, and then, ascending high, played in floods of pale light on the rocky hills of this second Pelion. The island was familiar to the crew of the young Amelia. It was one of her regular haunts. As to Dantes, he had passed it on his voyage to and from the Levant, but never touched at it. He questioned Jacopo. "Where shall we pass the night?" he inquired. "Why, on board the tartan," replied the sailor. "Should we not do better in the grottos?" "What grottos?" "Why, the grottos, caves of the island." "I do not know of any grottos," replied Jacopo. The cold sweat sprang forth on Dante's brow. "What? Are there no grottos at Monte Cristo?" he asked. "None." For a moment Dantes was speechless. Then he remembered that these caves might have been filled up by some accident, or even stopped up for the sake of greater security by Cardinal Spada. The point was, then, to discover the hidden entrance. It was useless to search at night, and Dantes therefore delayed all investigation until the morning. Besides, a signal made half a league out at sea, and to which the young Amelia replied by a similar signal, indicated that the moment for business had come. The boat that now arrived, assured by the answering signal that all was well, soon came in sight, white and silent as a phantom, and cast anchor within a cable's length of shore. Then the landing began. Dantes reflected as he worked on the shout of joy which, with a single word, he could evoke from all these men, if he gave utterance to the one unchanging thought that pervaded his heart. But, far from disclosing this precious secret, he almost feared that he had already said too much, and by his restlessness and continual questions, his minute observations and evident preoccupation, aroused suspicions. Fortunately, as regarded this circumstance at least, his painful past gave to his countenance an indelible sadness, and the glimmerings of gaiety seen beneath this cloud were indeed but transitory. No one had the slightest suspicion, and when next day, taking a fowling piece, powder, and shot, Dantes declared his intention to go and kill some of the wild goats that were seen springing from rock to rock, his wish was construed into a love of sport or a desire for solitude. However, Jacopo insisted on following him, and Dantes did not oppose this, feeling, if he did so, that he might incur distrust. Scarcely, however, had they gone a quarter of a league, when, having killed a kid, he begged Jacopo to take it to his comrades and request them to cook it, and when ready to let him know by firing a gun. This, and some dried fruits, and a flask of Montepulciano, was the bill of fare. Dantes went on, looking from time to time behind and around about him. Having reached the summit of a rock, he saw, 1,000 feet beneath him, his companions, whom Jacopo had rejoined, and who were all busy preparing the repast which Edmund's skill as a marksman had augmented with a capital dish. Edmund looked at them for a moment with the sad and gentle smile of a man superior to his fellows. "In 2 hours' time," said he, "these persons will depart richer by 50 piastres each, to go and risk their lives again by endeavouring to gain 50 more. Then they will return with a fortune of 600 francs, and waste this treasure in some city with the pride of sultans and the insolence of nabobs. At this moment hope makes me despise their riches, which seem to me contemptible. Yet perchance tomorrow deception will so act on me that I shall, on compulsion, consider such a contemptible possession as the utmost happiness." "Oh, no," exclaimed Edmund, "that will not be. The wise, unerring Faria could not be mistaken in this one thing. Besides, it were better to die than to continue to lead this low and wretched life." Thus Dantes, who but 3 months before had no desire but liberty, had now not liberty enough, and panted for wealth. This cause was not in Dantes, but in Providence, who, while limiting the power of man, has filled him with boundless desires. Meanwhile, by a cleft between 2 walls of rock, following a path worn by a torrent, and which, in all human probability, human foot had never before trod, Dantes approached the spot where he supposed the grottos must have existed. Keeping along the shore and examining the smallest object with serious attention, he thought he could trace, on certain rocks, marks made by the hand of man. Time, which encrusts all physical substances with its mossy mantle, as it invests all things of the mind with forgetfulness, seemed to have respected these signs, which apparently had been made with some degree of regularity, and probably with a definite purpose. Occasionally the marks were hidden under tufts of myrtle, which spread into large bushes laden with blossoms, or beneath parasitical lichen. So Edmund had to separate the branches or brush away the moss to know where the guide marks were. The sight of marks renewed Edmund's fondest hopes. Might it not have been the Cardinal himself who had first traced them, in order that they might serve as a guide for his nephew in the event of a catastrophe which he could not foresee, would have been so complete? This solitary place was precisely suited to the requirements of a man desirous of burying treasure. Only, might not those betraying marks have attracted other eyes than those for whom they were made? And had the dark and wondrous island indeed faithfully guarded its precious secret? It seemed, however, to Edmund, who was hidden from his comrades by the inequalities of the ground, that at 60 paces from the harbour the marks ceased, nor did they terminate at any grotto. A large round rock, placed solidly on its base, was the only spot to which they seemed to lead. Edmund concluded that perhaps, instead of having reached the end of the route, he had only explored its beginning, and he therefore turned round and retraced his steps. Meanwhile his comrades had prepared the repast, had got some water from a spring, spread out the fruit and bread, and cooked the kid. Just at the moment when they were taking the dainty animal from the spit, they saw Edmund springing with the boldness of a chamois from rock to rock, and they fired the signal agreed upon. The sportsman instantly changed his direction and ran quickly towards them. But even while they watched his daring progress, Edmund's foot slipped, and they saw him stagger on the edge of a rock and disappear. They all rushed towards him, for all loved Edmund in spite of his superiority. Yet Jacopo reached him first. He found Edmund lying prone, bleeding, and almost senseless. He had rolled down a declivity of 12 or 15 feet. They poured a little rum down his throat, and this remedy, which had before been so beneficial to him, produced the same effect as formerly. Edmund opened his eyes, complained of a great pain in his knee, a feeling of heaviness in his head, and severe pains in his loins. They wished to carry him to the shore, but when they touched him, although under Jacopo's directions, he declared with heavy groans that he could not bear to be moved. It may be supposed that Dantes did not now think of his dinner, but he insisted that his comrades, who had not his reasons for fasting, should have their meal. As for himself, he declared that he had only need of a little rest, and that when they returned he should be easier. The sailors did not require much urging. They were hungry, and the smell of the roasted kid was very savoury, and your tars are not very ceremonious. An hour afterwards they returned. All that Edmund had been able to do was to drag himself about a dozen paces forward to lean against a moss-grown rock. But instead of growing easier, Dante's pains appeared to increase in violence. The old patron, who was obliged to sail in the morning in order to land his cargo on the frontiers of Piedmont and France, between Nice and Freou, urged Dantes to try and rise. Edmund made great exertions in order to comply, but at each effort he fell back, moaning and turning pale. "He has broken his ribs," said the commander in a low voice. "No matter, he is an excellent fellow, and we must not leave him. We will try and carry him on board the tartan." Dantes declared, however, that he would rather die where he was than undergo the agony which the slightest movement cost him. "Well," said the patron, "let what may happen, it shall never be said that we deserted a good comrade like you. We will not go till evening." This very much astonished the sailors, although not one opposed it. The patron was so strict that this was the first time they had ever seen him give up an enterprise or even delay in its execution. Dantes would not allow that any such infraction of regular and proper rules should be made in his favour. "No, no," he said to the patron, "I was awkward, and it is just that I pay the penalty of my clumsiness. Leave me a small supply of biscuit, a gun, powder, and balls to kill the kids or defend myself at need, and a pickaxe that I may build a shelter if you delay in coming back for me." "But you'll die of hunger," said the patron. "I would rather do so," was Edmund's reply, "than suffer the inexpressible agonies which the slightest movement causes me." The patron turned towards his vessel, which was rolling on the swell in the little harbour, and, with sails partly set, would be ready for sea when her toilet should be completed. "What are we to do, Maltese?" asked the captain. "We cannot leave you here so, and yet we cannot stay." "Go, go!" exclaimed Dantes. "We shall be absent at least a week," said the patron, "and then we must run out of our course to come here and take you up again." "Why," said Dantes, "if in 2 or 3 days you hail any fishing boat, desire them to come here to me. I will pay 25 piastres for my passage back to Leghorn. If you do not come across one, return for me." The patron shook his head. "Listen, Captain Baldy. There's one way of settling this," said Jacopo. "Do you go, and I will stay and take care of the wounded man." "And give up your share of the venture," said Edmund, "to remain with me?" "Yes," said Jacopo, "and without any hesitation." "You are a good fellow, and a kind-hearted messmate," replied Edmund, "and heaven will recompense you for your generous intentions. But I do not wish any one to stay with me. A day or 2 of rest will set me up, and I hope I shall find among the rocks certain herbs most excellent for bruises." A peculiar smile passed over Dante's lips. He squeezed Jacopo's hand warmly, but nothing could shake his determination to remain, and remain alone. The smugglers left with Edmund what he had requested, and set sail, but not without turning round several times, and each time making signs of a cordial farewell, to which Edmund replied with his hand only, as if he could not move the rest of his body. Then, when they had disappeared, he said with a smile, "'Tis strange that it should be among such men that we find proofs of friendship and devotion." Then he dragged himself